The glorious, definitive thump hiss was music to Karen Sterling's ears. It was the sound of order being restored, of rules being enforced, of righteousness prevailing. Standing partially concealed behind the meticulously trimmed ficus hedge that marked the entrance to the meadows at Whispering Pines, she felt a surge of profound satisfaction. The sun, still low in the eastern sky, cast long shadows across the asphalt. But to Karen, it was as if a holy light was illuminating her handiwork. A state-of-the-art, police-grade spike strip, laid with geometric precision across the width of Whispering Pines Lane. Her heart, a tight little fist of perpetual indignation, beat a triumphant rhythm against her ribs. For weeks, the Homeowners Association, of which she was the thrice-elected and undisputed president, had been plagued by a scourge. A new, less curated housing development had opened up 2 miles down the county road, and its residents had discovered that Whispering Pines Lane was a convenient shortcut to the main highway, shaving a full 4 minutes off their commute. They were invaders, outsiders who did not appreciate the $1.2 million median home value, the perfectly manicured lawns watered with recycled gray water per bylaw 7.4.c, or the tranquil, child-safe environment the HOA charter guaranteed. These interlopers brought, with them, their loud mufflers, their disregard for the 15 mph speed limit, and their infuriating sense of entitlement. Karen had tried everything. She had sent polite but firm letters. She had installed larger, more aggressive signage. She had even, in a moment of inspired passive aggression, personally stood at the entrance for 3 days, with a clipboard and a stopwatch, glaring at every non-resident vehicle. The speeding continued, a daily affront to the sanctity of the meadows. So, she had escalated. At last night's emergency HOA board meeting, she had unveiled her Master Gerald, a retired actuary who worshipped the ground Karen's orthopedic New Balances walked on, had called it genius. Martha, the treasurer, had nervously wrung her hands, muttering about liability, but Karen had quelled the dissent with a powerful speech on the moral imperative to protect their community. "Are we a neighborhood of laws?" she had thundered, her voice echoing in the small clubhouse, "or a mere thoroughfare for the unwashed masses?" They had voted yes, barely. And now, the first fruit of her victory, a silver minivan, precisely the sort of family-hauling vessel the shortcutters favored, had just turned into their lane, clearly exceeding the 15 mph limit. It had crested the small decorative rise in the road designed for traffic calming, though it had proven woefully ineffective and met its fate. The front tires blew with a percussive bang, the vehicle swerving violently before lurching to a halt not 50 feet from Karen's observation post. Perfect. Karen smoothed the front of her wrinkle-free linen blouse, adjusted the lanyard holding her official HOA president badge, and stepped out from behind the hedge. This was a critical moment. It wasn't just about stopping a car, it was about establishing a precedent. She held a freshly printed citation in her hand, laminated and ready for delivery. Violation code for B: reckless driving, endangerment of community assets. Fine, $500, plus cost of any damages. As she approached, the driver's side door opened. A young woman, maybe 30, with frazzled blonde hair and yoga pants, stumbled out. Her face was pale with shock. "What the hell was that?" she cried out, her voice shaky. From the back of the minivan came a new sound, a piercing wail that grated on Karen's nerves. A baby, of course. They always used children as emotional shields. "Good morning," Karen said, her tone a carefully calibrated blend of authority and condescension. "Welcome to the meadows at Whispering Pines. It appears you've had some trouble." The young woman, Sarah, stared at Karen, then at her shredded tires, then back at Karen. Her eyes widened as she noticed the menacing black strips stretched across the road. Did you do this? What is that?" "This is a private, residential community," Karen stated, holding up the citation as if it were a holy tablet. "The posted speed limit is 15 miles per hour. According to my calculations, you were traveling at approximately 28. She had used a radar gun she'd bought on Amazon. "It was an excellent investment. This device is a traffic enforcement measure, approved by the HOA board, to ensure the safety of our residents." Sarah's shock was rapidly curdling into outrage. "A non-lethal? You blew out my tires. I have a baby in the car. Are you insane?" The wailing from the back seat intensified. "The safety of the children residing in this community is my paramount concern," Karen countered smoothly, unfazed by the hysterics. "Had you been adhering to the clearly posted regulations, your vehicle would have remained perfectly unharmed. The spikes are designed to retract 4 vehicles moving at or below the legal speed limit. This was a complete fabrication." Gerald had asked about that feature, and the online seller had confirmed it didn't exist. But it sounded official and shifted the blame squarely onto the violator. "I'll need you to sign here, acknowledging receipt of the violation," she proffered. The laminated sheet and a pen. Sarah stared at her as if she had just sprouted a second head. "Sign? I'm not signing anything. You're going to pay to fix my van? This is illegal." "I can assure you it is not," Karen said, her smile tightening. Section 12, Article 2 of the HOA Charter grants the board broad authority to take any and all necessary measures to preserve the peace, tranquility, and safety of the community. This, she gestured grandly at the scene of destruction, is a necessary measure. Sarah ignored the citation and pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers jabbing at the screen. I'm calling the police. An excellent idea, Karen said with a serene nod. They can document your reckless driving. Perhaps you'll be more inclined to respect the law when it's explained by a uniformed officer. The wait was not long. Karen remained in her position, a sentinel of suburban justice, while Sarah paced by her crippled minivan, trying to soothe her screaming child over the phone. To her husband, every passing moment felt like a vindication. The message was being sent. The line was being drawn. A car approached from within the community, heading out. It was a dark blue Ford Explorer, the kind that was ubiquitous in neighborhoods like this. It slowed to a crawl as the driver took in the scene. The disabled minivan, the frantic mother, the spike strip, and Karen standing proudly beside it all. The Explorer pulled over to the side of the road, and the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, in his late 40s, with a calm, composed demeanor that immediately annoyed Karen. He wasn't wearing a uniform, just a simple polo shirt and jeans, a resident good. Another witness to the triumph of HOA governance. Ma'am, everything all right over here? The man asked, his voice even and steady. He looked from Karen to Sarah, his eyes taking in every detail with a practiced efficiency. Everything is perfectly under control, Karen announced. This individual, she said, flicking her eyes toward Sarah, chose to ignore our community's speed limit and has suffered the predictable consequences. The man's gaze fell on the spike strip. He crouched down, examining it without touching it. A Caltrop-Marknine deployment system, he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. He stood up, his expression unreadable. Ma'am, did you place this device in the road? As president of the Homeowners Association, I authorized its deployment. Yes, Karen said, puffing out her chest slightly. We have a significant problem with transient traffic cutting through our private roads. The man nodded slowly. He walked over to Sarah, who was now weeping softly. Are you and your child okay, ma'am? My tires are gone. I was so scared. He's only 6 months old, Sarah sobbed. The man gave her a reassuring look. I understand. Just stay calm. The police are on their way. He then turned back to Karen. His calm was starting to feel less like a resident's curiosity and more like something else, something professional. And you are? Karen demanded, annoyed at being momentarily ignored. My name is David Miller, he said, pulling a wallet from his back pocket. He flipped it open, revealing not a driver's license, but a polished gold badge. I live at 12 Elm Street, right around the corner, and I'm the chief of traffic enforcement for the entire city. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The triumphant symphony in Karen's head screeched to a halt, replaced by a deafening, static silence. The chief of traffic enforcement, her chief, he lived here. Chief Miller's eyes, which had seemed placid moments before, now held the cold, hard glint of steel. Karen, he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its neighborly warmth. He knew her name. Of course he knew her. Namesha sent him HOA newsletters every month. You have created a public hazard on a roadway. You have willfully and maliciously destroyed private property. You have installed an illegal and unapproved traffic control device, which in this state constitutes a felony. And you've done it all. It seems, in the name of a 15-mile-per-hour speed limit. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over the scene again. The city thanks you for providing such a clear and well-documented case study in reckless endangerment. We'll be impounding this. He gestured to the spike strip as evidence. I expect my officers here in 5 minutes. Do not leave. In fact, don't move a muscle. Karen stood frozen, the laminated citation still. The thin, crisp sheets of the summons felt heavier than lead in Karen Sterling's hands. The air in the clubhouse, once thick with her own righteous fury, was now choked with the foul stench of cowardice. The 2 police officers had departed, leaving behind a silence more damning than any accusation. Martha, the treasurer, was the first to break. Her face, usually a pleasant shade of beige, had turned the color of spoilt milk. That's it, she gasped, clutching her chest as if the city attorney's letter had physically struck her. I resign, effective immediately. I will not be party to this madness. My husband has a heart condition. She didn't wait for an acknowledgement. She scrambled from her chair, her sensible walking shoes squeaking in terror on the linoleum floor, and fled into the night. Ben, the tech bro contrarian, stood up slowly, a look of grim vindication on his face. I'm calling my own lawyer tomorrow morning, not for the HOA, for me, to see what I need to do to insulate myself from the crater you're about to create. Karen. He looked at her, then at Gerald, who sat gaping like a beached fish. You're on your own. I'm abstaining from all board activities until this is resolved. He too walked out, leaving the door to swing shut with a soft, final click. The great Council of the Meadows at Whispering Pines, reduced from a quorum of 5 to a desperate party of 2. Traitors, Gerald hissed, his jowls quivering with indignation. They've abandoned ship at the first sign of a squall. Let them go, Gerald, Karen said, her voice a low, dangerous hum. She placed the legal documents on the meeting table with deliberate care, smoothing them out as if they were battle plans. Fear was a weed. You had to pull it out at the root before it choked the garden. Martha and Ben were weeds. They lack conviction. They don't understand what's at stake. But what do we do, Karen? Gerald asked, his bravado deflating into worried puppy dog eyes. They're suing us. They're suing you. They are not suing us, Karen corrected, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the summons. They are attacking an idea. The idea that a community has the right to govern itself. The idea that property rights are sacred. And when an idea is under attack, you don't hire a simple lawyer. You hire a crusader. The next morning, Karen bypassed the local law firms with their bland television commercials and golf sponsorships. She drove 45 minutes into the heart of the city, to a granite-faced building that looked less like an office and more like a mausoleum for forgotten kings. The brass plaque on the door read simply, Finch. Augustus Finch was a man who seemed to have been carved from old mahogany. He was impossibly thin, dressed in a three-piece tweed suit despite the summer heat, with a shock of white hair that defied gravity and a pair of spectacles perched on the end of his hawk-like nose. His office smelled of leather-bound books, pipe tobacco, and century-old contempt for the common man. Karen laid out her case, carefully editing the narrative. She wasn't a woman who had recklessly endangered a mother and child. She was a civic leader protecting her constituents from dangerous interlopers. The spike strip wasn't a vigilante weapon. It was a passive traffic flow regulation device. Chief Miller wasn't a concerned lawman. He was a state agent, engaged in a campaign of targeted harassment and intimidation against a private entity. Finch listened, his long skeletal fingers steepled under his chin. He did not interrupt. When Karen finished, a slow reptilian smile spread across his thin lips. Magnificent, he breathed, the words slithering out. Absolutely magnificent. Mrs. Sterling, you are a bulwark against the creeping tide of municipal socialism. Karen felt a warmth spread through her chest. Finally, someone who understood. The city, in its infinite arrogance, Finch continued, rising from his chair to pace before a window that overlooked a soulless concrete plaza, believes its authority is absolute. It views private covenant-controlled communities not as bastions of liberty, but as rogue provinces to be brought to heel. They despise the very concept of self-determination. He spun around, his eyes alight with a zealous fire. This is not a case about a traffic violation, my dear woman. This is a battle for the soul of property law itself. He laid out his strategy. It was not a defense. It was a blitzkrieg. First, he declared, holding up a single, bony finger. We file a motion to dismiss the criminal charges on jurisdictional grounds. Whispering Pines Lane is a private road, maintained by private funds. The city's vehicle code is arguably inapplicable. We will drown them in precedent, dating back to the Magna Carta. Second, another finger joined the first. We file our countersuit against David Miller personally. We will accuse him of malfeasance, abuse of power, and intentional infliction of emotional distress upon you and your community. We will subpoena his employment records, his performance reviews, his personal emails. We will make him toxic to his own administration. Third, his voice dropped conspiratorially. We go on the offensive against the internal dissent. We will draft letters to every homeowner, reminding them of their contractual obligations under the HOA charter. We will inform them that any cooperation with the city's lawsuit could be construed as a breach of that contract, making them personally liable for any damages. Karen was enthralled. This man was not a lawyer. He was a general. He was Richard, reborn with a law degree and a taste for blood. This is precisely what I envisioned, she said. Finch smiled again. Excellence requires resources, Mrs. Sterling. My firm is not merely excellent, it is preeminent. My retainer for a case of this magnitude is $50,000. The number hung in the air, heavy and solid. The HOA's entire liquid reserve fund, the money set aside for pool maintenance and clubhouse repairs, was 32. Martha's panicked resignation meant those funds were now effectively frozen until a new treasurer could be appointed and gain signatory authority at the bank. The funds are temporarily tied up in an administrative transition, Karen said, choosing her words carefully. Then untie them, Finch said flatly, or find another source. The city's lawyers are billing by the hour, and their supply of hours is infinite. Yours is not. I will not file a single piece of paper until my retainer is paid in full. The drive back to the meadows felt different. The perfect lawns and identical mailboxes seemed to mock her. They were assets to be protected, but they were owned by people who would have to pay. That evening, Karen and Gerald sat at her immaculate dining room table. The HOA charter spread between them like a holy text. We have no choice, Karen declared, her finger tracing a line in Article 4, Section 9, Special Assessments. The Board of Directors may levy, in any assessment year, a special assessment applicable to that year only for the purpose of defraying, in whole or in part, the cost of any unforeseen construction, reconstruction, repair or replacement of a capital improvement upon the common area, or for other such extraordinary expenses as may arise. Extraordinary expenses, Gerald read aloud. his eyes gleaming. A lawsuit from the city is certainly extraordinary. Augustus Finch's legal fees are an extraordinary expense, Karen clarified. The lawsuit is merely the catalyst. We are not paying for a defense. We are paying for a fortification of our rights. She drafted the email herself. It was a masterpiece of manipulative rhetoric. It spoke of external aggressors and our cherished way of life. It framed the $50,000 legal retainer not as a fee, but as a community sovereignty defense fund. It announced a one-time non-negotiable emergency assessment of $417 per household, due in 14 days. Failure to pay would result in standard penalties, interest, liens, and the suspension of privileges to use the community pool and tennis courts. She hit send just before midnight, feeling the decisive thrill of a commander launching a preemptive strike. The first explosion came at 7 a.m. the next morning. It was an email from Ben, the tech guy, but it wasn't sent to Karen. It was sent to every single homeowner in the Meadows. The subject line was, "Urgent, unauthorized $417 sovereignty fee and HOA recall." The email was a dagger. It laid out the facts in cold, simple terms. Karen had installed an illegal spike strip. The HOA was being sued. The HOA's insurance had already sent a reservation of rights letter, indicating they would likely not cover damages from such a reckless, intentional act. The $50,000 was to pay for Karen's hand-picked ultra-aggressive lawyer to fight a battle the community couldn't win, and most didn't want. He concluded by attaching the relevant section of the charter for initiating a recall vote of an HOA board member and a link to a secure online petition. "We need 25% of homeowners' 30 households to sign to force a special meeting," he wrote. "As of this morning, we already have 12. The digital dam broke. The official HOA inbox, which Karen monitored personally, was flooded. People she had shared pleasantries with 4 years over rose bushes and recycling bins were sending messages filled with fury. From Bob at 6 Willow Creek. "Karen, are you out of your mind? My wife and I are pensioners. Where are we supposed to get $417? From the Patels at 14 Oakmont? We are paying for your mistake. We will be seeking our own legal counsel. This is extortion." From Susan at 12 Elm Street, Chief Miller's wife, a short, chilling message. "David and I will be at any and all community meetings regarding this. See you soon." Karen felt a tremor of panic, but the judge's words echoed in Karen's ears long after she had left the sterile wood-paneled courtroom. They were a hammer blow not just to her legal case, but to the very bedrock of her worldview. A road regularly open to public vehicular traffic, regardless of who pays for its upkeep, falls under the state's legitimate interest in public safety. Your motion to dismiss is denied, Mr. Finch. Augustus Finch had tried to spin it in the hallway, his whispery voice full of false bravado. "An activist judge, an appealable error. This only strengthens our position by exposing the court's bias." But Karen wasn't listening. For the first time, an authority higher than her own, higher even than the sacred HOA charter, had looked at her actions and declared them unequivocally wrong. The feeling was nauseating, like the world tilting off its axis. The drive back to the Meadows was a journey through enemy territory. Every recall Karen Sterling sign on every perfectly manicured lawn was a personal affront, a little dagger twisting in her gut. These people, her people, were celebrating her. Humiliation. The news of the failed motions spread through the neighborhood's email chains like wildfire. Ben's concerned homeowners group hailed it as a victory for common sense. The HOA's bank account, already savaged by Finch's $50,000 retainer, was now facing the prospect of a full-blown, and likely unwinnable, criminal trial. The Sovereignty Defense Fund was not only empty, it was a source of bitter mockery. With the recall meeting looming in just 3 days, Karen felt the walls of her pristine kingdom closing in. Her legal shield was gone. Her popular support had evaporated. Her only remaining ally was Gerald, whose loyalty was becoming increasingly tinged with a high-pitched whining panic. "They're going to vote us out, Karen," he'd lamented over the phone earlier that day. "Ben is already talking about conducting a forensic audit of the HOA finances. Once he's president, they'll say we misappropriated funds for Finch." "We did not misappropriate," Karen had snapped, her voice colder and sharper than usual. "We allocated funds to counter an existential threat. They are too blind to see it." But even as she said it, a cold tendril of fear coiled in her stomach. An audit. They would comb through every expenditure, every decision. They would try to erase her legacy, paint her as a villain, a tyrant. The thought was unbearable. An autocrat, faced with a democratic ousting they cannot win, has only one logical move: cancel the election. That night, she summoned Gerald to her home, not for tea and biscuits in the formal living room, but for a hushed, conspiratorial meeting in her garage. The air thick with the smell of fertilizer and cedar mulch. "The recall meeting cannot be allowed to proceed," she stated, her face illuminated by the stark, unforgiving light of a single bare bulb. "It is an illegitimate gathering, fueled by misinformation and personal vendettas. It is a threat to the stability of this community." "But how can we stop it?" Gerald bleated, wringing his hands. "The charter is clear. They have the signatures." Karen held up a single, imperious finger. "The charter," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "also contains Article 7, Section 4, Emergency Facility Closure. The board president has the authority to temporarily close any common area, including the clubhouse, in the event of a sudden and severe threat to the health and safety of residents." Gerald's eyes widened as he began to understand. A threat? What threat? A sudden, catastrophic plumbing failure? Karen said, a thin, dangerous smile playing on her lips. A biohazard, a Class 3 water event. The clubhouse would be unusable for weeks. By the time it's repaired, this fervor will have died down. We will have time to regroup, to reassert control. It was insane. It was brilliant. It was, to Karen's mind, a perfectly logical and necessary act of executive leadership. They struck just after 2 a.m., dressed in dark clothing. They used Karen's presidential key to let themselves into the silent sleeping clubhouse. The air inside was still and smelled faintly of air freshener and the lingering disappointment of last year's holiday potluck. "The main water shutoff for the building is in the men's restroom utility closet," Karen whispered, producing a large pipe wrench from a canvas bag. "We won't turn off the water. We will simply compromise a joint." Their attempt at sabotage was a masterclass in dark slapstick. Gerald, clumsy and nervous, dropped the heavy wrench, which landed with a deafening clang that made them both freeze for a full minute. When he finally managed to put the wrench on the chosen pipe joint under the industrial sink, he turned it the wrong way, tightening it first with a loud squeal of metal. "The other way, you imbecile," Karen hissed. Gerald grunted, reversing direction. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting copper, the joint gave way. It wasn't the steady leak Karen had envisioned. The PVC pipe connected to the metal joint shattered, and a hyper-shear geyser of cold water erupted from the wall, instantly soaking Gerald and spraying across the room. Panic seized them. This wasn't a controllable leak. It was a deluge. Water was already pooling on the floor, spreading with terrifying speed toward the carpeted meeting area. "Out, now," Karen commanded. They fled, leaving the door unlocked behind them, the sound of rushing water filling the night. As they scurried back across the duet grass to the safety of Karen's house, she felt a surge of grim satisfaction. It was messy, yes, but it was decisive. There would be no meeting. She had won. She slept soundly for the first time in weeks. The sleep of a monarch who has successfully quelled a rebellion. She awoke at dawn, made her tea, and sat at her breakfast nook, waiting for the inevitable. Panicked email from Ben, announcing the cancellation. The email arrived at 8:15 a.m., but it was not the one she was expecting. Subject: important venue change. For HOA recall meeting. Dear homeowners, it seems our community was the victim of a rather extreme act of vandalism last night. The clubhouse has suffered a major flood and is completely unusable. Photos attached. The damages are estimated to be in the tens of thousands of dollars, and a police report has been filed. But the democratic process will not be deterred. I am pleased to announce that we have secured a new venue for the recall meeting tomorrow night. Thanks to the generosity of the City Council, we will be holding the meeting in the main gymnasium of the Northgate Community Center, located just outside our entrance. The city has waived all rental fees. Furthermore, given the unfortunate circumstances and the clear attempt to intimidate our members, Chief of Traffic Enforcement David Miller, in his capacity as a concerned resident, has arranged for 2 uniformed city police officers to be present to ensure the meeting proceeds in a safe and orderly fashion. The vote will proceed as planned. See you all tomorrow night. Karen read the email 3 times. The teacup in her hand trembled, rattling against its saucer. A cold, heavy dread, far worse than anything she'd felt at the courthouse, settled in her stomach. It was a checkmate. A move so brilliant in its simplicity, she could only stare in stunned horror. Her desperate act of sabotage had not only failed, it had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. She had not only failed to stop the vote, she had moved it off her sovereign soil and into the enemy's camp. She had legitimized an official police presence at her own dethroning, and she had single-handedly caused catastrophic financial damage to the very community she claimed to be protecting. Damage that the HOA's increasingly skeptical insurance provider would almost certainly refuse to cover. Citing the obvious vandalism, her final act as president would be to bankrupt the kingdom. The phone buzzed. It was Gerald. She ignored it. It buzzed again. Gerald, no doubt weeping and terrified. She silenced the phone and stared out her window. The world outside was still perfect, a grass green, the sky blue, the houses all in neat, orderly rows. But it was a facade. Her world was collapsing. She walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the framed photograph of her late husband. His stern, confident face stared back at her. "Order, Richard," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Discipline. Strength. I did everything you said. I was strong, I never compromised." But for the first time, a heretical thought entered her mind. Richard's rules were for a world of spreadsheets and tax codes. They were binary, logical, clean. They were not for a world of messy human emotions, of petty resentments, and stubborn collective will. She had tried to impose a rigid, unbending order on a living, breathing community, and it had shattered in her hands. She had become the chaos she sought to contain. The fight seemed to drain out of her, leaving an empty, aching void. She was beaten, utterly and completely outmaneuvered. Ben, the tech bro she'd dismissed as a nuisance, and David Miller, the quiet traitor, had used her own aggression against her, turning her strength into a fatal weakness. She sank into her armchair, the silence of the perfect house pressing in on her. She was an empress with no empire, a general with no army. All that was left was the public humiliation of the recall vote tomorrow night. For hours, she sat there. Then, as dusk began to settle, her gaze fell upon the thick, leather-bound cope. The evening of the recall vote, Karen did not dress for a surrender. She dressed for war. Her armor was a charcoal gray pantsuit with a brutally sharp cut, a silk blouse buttoned all the way to her throat, and low, sensible heels that made no sound as she paced on her marble entryway floor. On her polished dining room table, she assembled her arsenal, a pristine copy of the HOA charter, a list of 15 delinquent households, and 15 blank proxy forms, each one a potential soldier. In her last-ditch counteroffensive, Gerald arrived precisely at 6:45 p.m., his face the color of wet cement. He was wearing a rumpled blazer and smelled faintly of mouthwash and terror. "Karen, my stomach is in knots. They're all going to be there. They'll be shouting," he whimpered. "Let them shout," Karen said, her voice eerily calm as she placed the proxy forms into a leather portfolio. "Their shouting is irrelevant. All that matters is the law." She looked at him, her eyes as hard and cold as river stones. "Your role tonight is simple, Gerald. You will sit beside me. You will not speak. You will not flinch. You will project an aura of absolute confidence. Is that clear?" Gerald nodded, swallowing hard. "Confidence, right?" The Northgate Community Center gymnasium was a cavern of hostility. The humming fluorescent lights cast a sickly yellow pallor on everything, a stark contrast to the warm, inviting glow of the lost clubhouse. The air, thick with the phantom smell of sweat and floor wax, echoed with the low murmur of the assembled residents, her residents who sat in neat rows of metal folding chairs. As Karen and Gerald entered, the murmuring ceased. 100 pairs of eyes tracked them as they walked to the table at the front marked Board of Directors. It felt less like an entrance and more like a perp walk. Ben was already at the main table, looking composed and professional in a crisp button-down shirt. He gave Karen a curt, neutral nod. In the front row sat Chief David Miller and his wife, Susan. They were not there as city officials, but as homeowners. Yet Miller's presence radiated an authority that eclipsed everyone else's. He watched Karen with a calm, analytical gaze that she found more unsettling than any open anger. By the main doors, 2 uniformed police officers stood with their arms crossed, their presence a silent testament to how far things had escalated. Ben tapped the microphone. "Good evening, everyone. Welcome. In accordance with the HOA charter and the successful recall petition, this special meeting is now called to order." He was good, Karen had to admit. He was calm, procedural, and followed Robert's rules of order. To the letter, he explained the reason for the recall, citing the unauthorized spike strip, the pending lawsuits, the extreme financial liability from the clubhouse, vandalism, and what he termed a pattern of punitive and divisive leadership. "Before we proceed to the vote," Ben said, "the floor is open for comments from homeowners. Please keep your remarks to 2 minutes. The hands shot up instantly. Bob, the pensioner from 6 Willow Creek, was the first to the microphone. His voice trembled with an old man's indignation. "I've lived here for 20 years, he began. I served on the board in the early days. We were neighbors. We helped each other. Last month, President Sterling fined me $50 because I hung a small flag for the university my grandson attends. Then she tried to levy another $400 from my pension to pay for a lawyer I don't want. To fight a battle, she started. This isn't neighborly. This is tyranny." He was followed by Mrs. Patel from 14 Oakmont. "President Sterling talks about rules and safety, but she does not apply them equally. She has waged a campaign of harassment against families with children. She'll find us for a basketball hoop that has been there for 3 years, a hoop that brings joy to our kids. Her actions are not about order. They are about control and cruelty." One by one they came, a parade of the aggrieved. A resident with legal expertise laid out the likely financial fallout, estimating that between the lawsuits and the non-covered damages to the clubhouse, every homeowner could be looking at a special assessment in the thousands, not hundreds. The mood in the room grew darker and angrier with each speaker. Through it all, Karen sat ramrod straight, her expression an unreadable mask. She did not look at the speakers. She stared at a fixed point. On the far wall, absorbing their words like arrows against a shield, they were fools. All of them, ingrates. They couldn't see the simple truth. A paradise requires a vigilant gatekeeper, and sometimes the gatekeeper must be cruel. Finally, Ben said, "President Sterling, you have 5 minutes for a rebuttal." Karen rose and walked to the podium with deliberate, unhurried steps. The gymnasium fell into a profound silence. "I have listened to your grievances," she began, her voice crisp and clear, amplified by the microphone. "I have heard your complaints about flags, and basketball hoops, and money. and what I hear is the bleating of sheep who have forgotten that the wolf is real. A low murmur of disbelief went through the crowd. For years, I have dedicated myself to preserving the value, tranquility, and, yes, the exclusivity of this community. I have done the hard, thankless work that none of you were willing to do. I have enforced the rules that you all agreed to when you bought your homes, the rules that protect your property values. When our safety was threatened by outside traffic, I took decisive action. You call it illegal. I call it leadership. When our sovereignty was challenged by the city, I secured the best possible legal defense. You call it expensive. I call it a necessary defense of our rights. She leaned forward, her knuckles white on the podium. You don't like my methods. You find my vigilance uncomfortable. You want a president who will be your friend, who will overlook your minor infractions and tell you what you want to hear. But you do not need a friend. You need a protector. You are recalling me tonight not because I have failed you, but because I have succeeded all too well in creating an orderly, the world that you are no longer strong enough to stomach. You have grown soft in the paradise I have maintained. She concluded without a hint of apology. Vote as you will, but know that you are trading a sword for a pillow. She returned to her seat, her heart hammering with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Ben, looking slightly stunned by her sheer audacity, cleared his throat. Thank you, Mrs. Sterling. We will now proceed to the vote. The motion is the recall of Karen Sterling as HOA president. I will call out each household by address. Please respond with a clear aye for recall, or nay to oppose. The roll call began. 1 Willow Creek, 2 Willow Creek aye, 3 Willow Creek, nay, that was Gerald, 4 Willow Creek, aye. The ayes cascaded through the room, an avalanche of dissent. Karen kept her own tally on a notepad. After just 20 minutes, the numbers were brutal. Ben paused. The current tally stands at 50 votes of aye and 30 votes of nay, with only 40 households remaining. The motion is mathematically certain to pass. Point of order, Karen said, standing up. Her voice cut through the room like shattering glass. All eyes snapped to her. A point of order, Ben asked, confused. On what grounds? On the grounds of Article 9, Section 4 of the official HOA Charter, Karen announced, walking back to the podium and placing the leather-bound book upon it with a solid thud. She opened it to a page she had marked. The Charter. Our governing document states, she read, her voice ringing with triumph. The acting president of the board of directors is empowered to cast proxy votes on behalf of any homeowner who is delinquent in their dues and/or fees by more than 90 days. She paused, letting the words sink in. An uneasy quiet fell over the room as people tried to process the arcane rule. What are you saying, Karen? Ben asked, a note of dread in his voice. I am saying, Karen declared, holding up her list, that I have identified 15 households who, due to unpaid fines and the now overdue special assessment, are technically delinquent. As such, their right to vote is temporarily suspended and transferred, by proxy, to me. The room exploded. Shouts of "Nope, you can't do that" erupted from all corners. Bob the pensioner was on his feet, his face purple with rage. You're disenfranchising us with fines you invented. Karen held up her hand for silence, a gesture of supreme, unearned authority. The rules are the rules, she shouted over the din. You all agreed to them. She turned to Ben, her eyes blazing. I have here 15 signed and notarized proxy forms. I am now officially casting their votes. She held up the first form. On behalf of 6 Willow Creek, I cast a vote of nay. She held up the next. On behalf of 14 Oakmont, I cast a vote of nay. One by one, she announced them, her voice a death knell to the recall. With each nay, a gasp or a curse rose from the crowd. She was taking the votes of her greatest critics and using them as a shield. It was a breathtakingly cynical and brilliant maneuver. When she was finished, she looked at Ben. Please adjust the tally. Ben stood frozen for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief. The lawyer resident was shouting about unconscionable contracts in bad faith, but the text of the bylaw was, on its face, clear. Ben, slowly, reluctantly, updated the numbers on the whiteboard. The 15 aye votes from the delinquent households were struck. The 15 nay votes from Karen's proxies were added. The new total. For a long, silent moment, the word forgery hung in the stale gymnasium air, utterly eclipsing Karen's Pyrrhic victory. The sea of hateful faces that had been staring at her in stunned defeat now morphed into a gallery of morbidly fascinated onlookers at an execution. The 2 uniformed officers moved with a calm, deliberate purpose that was far more terrifying than any shouted accusation. Time seemed to warp from Karen's perspective. The squeak of their rubber-soled shoes on the polished floor was deafening. The whispered gasps of her neighbors sounded like a distant wind. Her meticulously constructed world, a fortress built of bylaws and righteous indignation, was not just being breached, it was being vaporized. The first officer reached her. Ma'am, he said, his voice polite but firm, utterly devoid of emotion. I'm going to have to ask you to place your hands behind your back. Karen's mind simply refused to process the request. She looked past him, her eyes searching for an ally, an explanation, anything. She saw Ben, his face a mixture of shock and grim vindication. She saw the Patels and old Bob, their personal anger now replaced by a kind of awed horror. She saw Gerald, dear, loyal Gerald, whose face had gone from pale to a ghastly, translucent white, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he slumped sideways in his chair in a dead faint. No one moved to help him, and then she saw Chief Miller. He hadn't moved. He was just watching, his expression one of profound, weary sadness. There was no triumph in his eyes, only the grim finality of a job he hadn't wanted but was due to complete. It was in that moment that Karen finally understood. This was not a debate. This was not a negotiation. This was the real world, with its real rules, crashing down upon her. Ma'am, the officer repeated, a little more firmly this time, slowly. As if moving through deep water, Karen placed her leather portfolio on the table and turned, putting her hands behind her, the cold metallic click of the handcuffs locking. Around her wrists was the loudest sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on her entire life. The walk from the podium to the gymnasium exit was the longest of her life. No one spoke, no one jeered. The silence was absolute. A thick, heavy blanket of communal judgment. They just watched her, the tyrant queen of the meadows, being led away in disgrace by the very forces of order she claimed to revere. This was the city's law, impersonal and inexorable, and it was infinitely more powerful than her laminated charters. The ride in the back of the police cruiser was a blur of passing streetlights and muted radio chatter. At the station, the process unfolded with a cold, bureaucratic efficiency that was a horrifying parody of the order she so loved. They took her photograph against a cinderblock walla mugshot, the ultimate violation of personal presentation. They rolled her fingertips in black ink and pressed them onto a card, a permanent record of her identity, now defined by this single, catastrophic failure. They took her sharp blazer and her sensible shoes, replacing them with a loose jumpsuit and thin plastic slippers. When they finally put her in a small, sterile holding cell, the heavy metal door clanging shut behind her, Karen slid down onto the hard bench, the adrenaline finally draining away, leaving only a cold, hollow terror. She had spent her life trying to build walls against the chaos of the outside world, and now she was caged within its most rigid institution. She finally asked to call her lawyer. Augustus Finch arrived 2 hours later, looking less like a crusading general and more like a vexed undertaker. Forgery, Karen, he hissed, his voice a dry whisper through the visitation glass. You didn't just check a box, you physically signed proxy forms. The charter empowered me, she insisted, her voice hoarse. It gave me their votes. Finch pressed his thin fingers to his temples, a gesture of pure exasperation. The charter, which is a civil agreement, may have given you the authority to cast a vote. It did not, and could not, grant you the authority to counterfeit a legal signature, which is a state-level felony. There is a chasm between those two actions, and you, my dear woman, have swanned right into it. His tone had changed completely. The talk of bulwarks and municipal socialism was gone. Now it was about exposure, plea bargains, and damage control. The district attorney is a hardliner. They will want to make an example of you, an affluent HOA president committing fraud at a public meeting. It's a prosecutor's dream. Your bail will be set high. My fees for a felony criminal defense of this complexity ... double quotes. Karen stopped listening. Her crusader had shed his armor. Underneath, he was just another man talking about money, already calculating how to profit from her ruin. She was no longer a client to champion. She was a mess to manage. After posting an astronomical bail by liquidating her life savings, Karen returned to the meadows at Whispering Pines. The recall Karen Sterling signs were gone, but the silence that replaced them was worse. When she drove through the gates, neighbors who were out walking their dogs or collecting their mail would turn away, suddenly fascinated by a cloud or a loose shoelace. If she went to her mailbox, the blinds on her next-door neighbor's window would slide shut. She was not a person anymore. She was a ghost, haunting the streets of her own lost kingdom. Ben, as vice president, had automatically become the acting president. He moved swiftly. An emergency fund was established to begin repairs on the clubhouse. A fine forgiveness program was announced, nullifying all of Karen's vindictive citations from the past month. A letter of apology was sent to every homeowner, along with a promise of complete transparency and a new election to fill the board vacancies. They were not just erasing her. They were systematically and efficiently healing the wounds she had inflicted. Karen spent her days in the suffocating perfection of her house. The karate-chopped pillows and aligned coasters no longer brought her comfort. They mocked her. They were the artifacts of a faith that had proven false. The order she had worshipped was a brittle, hollow thing. One afternoon, she stood before the photo of her husband on the mantelpiece. His stern, confident expression seemed to accuse her. I did what you said, Richard, she whispered, her voice thick with a sorrow so deep it felt like it was cracking her bones. I was strong. I was disciplined. I never compromised. She touched the cool glass of the frame. But the rules aren't enough. They aren't a shield. They're just lines. And people aren't numbers on a spreadsheet. I tried to force them into your perfect columns, and I broke them. I broke everything. Months Past in a blur of legal meetings and mounting dread, her trial date was set. Finch spoke of a possible plea deal that would keep her out of prison, but leave her a convicted felon for the rest of her life. Then, one bright Tuesday morning, as Karen was listlessly pulling a weed from her immaculate flower bed, the irony of the act was not lost on her Armada sedan she didn't recognize pulled up to the curb. A woman got out. It was Sarah, the young mother from the very beginning, the one whose minivan tires had been the first casualty of Karen's war. Karen braced herself, expecting a tirade, a gloating "I told you so," or worse, pity, but the expression was unreadable. She walked up the pristine flagstone path and stopped a few feet away. "Hello, Karen," she said, her voice even. "What do you want?" Karen asked, her own voice brittle. "The new HOA board settled the damages for my van," Sarah said. "They were very kind about it. They even sent a letter of apology on behalf of the community." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the quiet, peaceful street. "It's funny. Ever since that night at the community center, people actually drive slower through here. No one speeds anymore." Karen just stared, uncomprehending. "It's not because they're afraid," Sarah clarified gently. "I think it's because they started talking to each other. That whole mess, it forced them to become a community again." The final, crushing irony landed on Karen with the weight of a physical blow. The order she had tried to impose with spikes and fines had been achieved organically, as a side effect of her own downfall. "I didn't come here to gloat," Sarah said, seeming to read her mind. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, crisp business card. "My cousin is an investigative journalist. He's been following your case, and he finds it fascinating." Karen flinched. The last thing she wanted was more media attention. "He doesn't think the story is just about an out-of-control HOA president," Sarah continued, taking a step closer, and lowering her voice. "He started looking into your lawyer, Augustus Finch, it turns out. You're the fourth HOA president Mr. Finch has represented in the last 10 years who has ended up facing criminal charges after following his aggressive legal advice. He seems to have a pattern of finding clients who love rules and encouraging them to take extreme interpretations of their bylaws. It's almost as if he profits from the chaos and the multi-million-dollar lawsuits that always seem to follow." She held out the card. "My cousin's name is Daniel. He thinks you might not be the only villain in this story. He thinks you might just be the one who is designed to get caught." Sarah placed the business card on the low brick wall bordering the flower bed, then turned and walked back to her car without another word. Karen stood frozen, the small, insignificant weed still clutched in her hand. The sun was warm on her back, the neighborhood was quiet, and the world was orderly. For 3 days, the business card lay on Karen's granite countertop, a small rectangle of white paper that felt as heavy as a tombstone. Daniel Whitaker, investigative reporter. Each time she saw it, her stomach twisted with a familiar, bitter pride. Calling him would be an admission of defeat on a scale she had never contemplated. It would mean conceding that she, Karen Sterling, the master of her own perfectly curated universe, had been a fool. She spent those days wandering the silent, cavernous rooms of her home, the order she had once worshipped, now a suffocating prison. She replayed every conversation with Augustus Finch in her mind, his fawning praise of her magnificent stand, his dismissal of the city's legal threats as municipal blustering, his constant, subtle pressure to escalate, to attack, to never concede, all while his fees mounted. He hadn't just defended her, he had validated her, weaponized her worst instincts, and aimed her like a missile at the heart of her own community. And he had sent her the bill for the fuel. The terror of her impending trial was a physical thing, a cold dread that settled in her bones. She was facing prison. She, who had never had so much as a speeding ticket, was now a pariah entangled in 15 felony charges. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. On the 4th day, with a trembling hand that felt like a traitor to her own body, she picked up the phone and dialed Daniel Whitaker's number. They met in the hushed, dusty biography section of a downtown library, a neutral territory of forgotten lives. Daniel Whitaker was not what she had expected. He wasn't a slick, ambitious journalist, but a man in his late 40s with tired eyes, a rumpled blazer, and the weary air of someone who had heard every lie imaginable. He wasn't here to save her, he was here for a story. "Mrs. Sterling," he began, foregoing any pleasantries as they sat at a small, secluded table, "let's be blunt. My sources in the DA's office say they have you dead to rights on the forgery charges. You terrorized your neighbors and nearly bankrupted your HOA. Why should I, or anyone else, see you as anything other than the villain of this story?" The old Karen, the one from a month ago, would have bristled with indignation. But that Karen was gone, incinerated in the crucible of public humiliation and private terror. "Because," she said, her voice low and steady, "I may have been the weapon, Mr. Whitaker, but I believe Augustus Finch was the one pulling the trigger." For the next hour she recounted her journey. She spoke of how Finch had praised her spot strip idea, framing it as a righteous stand for property rights. How he had advised the countersuit against Chief Miller, knowing it would be inflammatory and exorbitantly expensive. How, at every turn, when a door to de-escalation opened, Finch had painted it as a sign of weakness and urged her to double down. He told me the proxy vote was a masterstroke of procedural genius, she said, the memory tasting like ash. He told me, never mentioned the word forgery. He spoke only of the charter, of my power as president. Daniel listened, his expression unchanging, taking sparse notes in a small, worn notebook. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You're not the first," he finally said, opening a folder he'd brought with him. He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a list of 4 names. 4 HOA presidents from affluent communities across the state. All former clients of Augustus Finch. Clee tapped the first name. Robert Cromwell, Ocean View Estates. A dispute over unapproved architectural modifications to a single home. Finch advised the board to file lawsuit after lawsuit, burying the homeowner in legal fees. The board won, but their legal costs bankrupted the HOA. Cromwell was ousted and sued by his own neighbors for financial malfeasance. He tapped the next name. Eleanor Vance, Cypress Ridge. A disagreement with the city over water reclamation. Finch convinced her to wage a war on municipal overreach. 2 years and $3 million in legal fees later, the HOA dissolved. Vance had to declare personal bankruptcy and faced a grand jury investigation. The pattern was undeniable. In every case, a minor dispute was fanned into an inferno. In every case, Finch was the one holding the bellows. In every case, the community was savaged by legal fees, and the board president was left holding the bag, publicly disgraced and legally exposed. Finch doesn't just represent his clients, Daniel said, his tired eyes showing a glimmer of predatory focus. He cultivates them. He finds people like you principled, rigid, convinced of their own righteousness, and he winds them up like toy soldiers and points them at the nearest wall, all while the meter is running at $1,000 an hour. The problem is proving it. Finch is brilliant. There will be no email saying go ahead and commit forgery. The advice would have been verbal, couched in hypotheticals and plausible deniability. So it's my word against his, Karen said, the flicker of hope dimming, and I'm the one facing 15 felony counts. Exactly, Daniel agreed, unless we can find something he never wanted anyone to see, something from inside his firm. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. I have a source, a name. A former paralegal at Finch's firm named Maria Sanchez. She was fired about a year ago, supposedly for poor performance. I think she got too close to something, asked the wrong questions. She signed a ferocious NDA. She's terrified of him, but she might be our only way in. The new objective was clear, and it was terrifying. To save herself, Karen Sterling, who had once considered even talking to the pool maintenance man beneath her head, to win the trust of a frightened, disgruntled paralegal, Maria Sanchez lived in a small third-floor apartment in a part of the city Karen had only ever seen through the tinted windows of her luxury sedan. The building's hallway smelled of stale cooking oil and disinfectant. The entire mission felt sordid, a desperate plunge into the very chaos she had built her life to avoid. When Maria opened the door, she was a young woman in her late 20s, with intelligent, wary eyes that widened in recognition and fear when she saw Karen. I know who you are, Maria said, her hand tightening on the door. You're one of his clients. I'm not talking to you. I'm not talking to anyone. Please, Karen said, the word feeling foreign and coarse in her own mouth. He is destroying my life, just as I'm sure he has threatened to destroy yours. You don't know anything, Maria snapped, but the fear in her eyes was mixed with a flicker of anger. That man is a monster. He finds good people who believe in rules, and he twists them into pretzels for profit. I saw what he was doing. The billing, it was creative. Let's say I started keeping my own records. He found out and he threatened me. He said if I ever spoke a word, he'd use his army of lawyers to paint me as a corporate thief and make sure I never worked in the legal field again. He'd sue me into oblivion. This was it. This was the moment. The old Karen would have used authority, or condescension, or a thinly veiled threat, but she had no authority left. All she had was the raw, humiliating truth. He's doing the same to me, Karen said, her voice stripped of its usual iron cladding. Only he doesn't need to threaten to sue me. He simply guided me into a cage and then handed the key to the district attorney. I was a fool. I was so convinced of my own righteousness, so blinded by my belief in the letter of the law, that I let him lead me right off a cliff. I am facing years in prison because I trusted him. She met Maria's gaze, holding nothing back. He will not stop with me, and he will never stop holding that thread over your head. The only way for either of us to be free is to expose him. Maria stared at her internal battle playing out across her face. The terror of Finch was powerful, but the simmering rage at the injustice done to her, and the unexpected raw vulnerability from this woman she'd expected to hate, was a potent combination. There might be a way, Maria whispered, finally cracking the door open a little wider. It's insane and dangerous. She pulled Karen inside, closing the door behind them. Finch is paranoid. He keeps 2 sets of books, the official firm records, and a private one. He called it his asset risk ledger. I saw it once, on his screen, when I brought him a file he'd asked for. It wasn't just billing. It was a strategy journal. It detailed his assessment of his clients' psychological profiles, their susceptibility to aggressive tactics, and his projected profit margins on their inevitable legal escalations. It's the smoking gun. It's everything. Where is it? Karen asked, her heart beginning to pound. On a private, air-gapped server in his office, Maria said, encrypted with military-grade security. I'm a good paralegal. I am not a hacker. There is no way I could get to it. She paused, chewing on her lip. But I know who could. A sense of dreadful premonition washed over Karen. Maria continued. Before I was fired, I had to coordinate with an outside contractor Finch hired to upgrade his office's network security. This guy was a genius, annoying, arrogant, but a true wizard. He said Finch's system was a fortress, but he also said, every fortress has a back door. If you know, who built the walls? Who is he? Karen breathed, almost afraid to hear the answer. Maria looked at her, a strange, almost pitying look in her eyes. You know him. He does freelance digital security consulting for high-net-worth individuals and small businesses. He's one of the best on the West Coast. She took a deep breath. His name is Ben Carmichael. He lives at 18 Crestview Drive, in the Meadows at